Good evening and welcome back to SF Commons. Tonight we will cover the global refugee crisis. We will be talking about the migration of refugees from the Middle East, specifically the countries of Libya, Iraq, and Syria. The causes behind the refugee crisis, what forced people to flee their homes in search for safety, the migration to Europe, specifically Germany, France, and Sweden. How these migration and refugees affect the social fabric of the countries that are hosting the refugees.
Here's the truth. About 10 days after 9/11, I went through the Pentagon and I saw Secretary Rumsfeld and Deputy Secretary Wolfowitz. I went downstairs just to say hello to some of the people on the Joint Staff who used to work for me, and one of the generals called me and he said, "Sir, you got to come in and talk to me a second." I said, "Well, you're too busy." He said, No. He says, "We've made the decision. We're going to war with Iraq." This was on or about the 20th of September. I said, "We're going to war with Iraq. Why?" He said, "I don't know." He said, "I guess they don't know what else to do." So I said, "Well, did they find some information connecting Saddam to Al-Qaeda?" He said, No. He says, "There's nothing new that way. They just made the decision to go to war with Iraq." He said, "I guess it's like we don't know what to do about terrorists, but we've got a good military and we can take down governments." And he said, "I guess if the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem has to look like a nail." So I came back to see him a few weeks later, and by that time we were bombing in Afghanistan. I said, "Are we still going to war with Iraq?" And he said, "Oh, it's worse than that." He said, he reached over on his desk, he picked up a piece of paper. He said, I just got this down from upstairs, meaning the Secretary of Defense's office today. And he said, "This is a memo that describes how we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran."
From CBS News headquarters in New York, here is Dan Rather.
It was just over 90 minutes beyond President Bush's deadline for Saddam Hussein to leave Iraq that U.S. warships and planes, there were F-117 stealth bombers involved, launched the opening salvo of Operation Iraqi Freedom. The attack came in waves, cruise missiles, followed by the F-117 stealth bombers with so-called bunker-busting bombs. Their target, a bunker believed to be sheltering what are called top leaders of the Iraqi regime. Now, this is what it looked and sounded like in Baghdad. It was this short, and this is what happened.
In 2005, but then in 2006, they hired British PR firm Bell Pottinger to create Iraq war propaganda, including fake terrorist videos, which we all saw of the men in the orange jumpsuits being supposedly beheaded, that was shown on Western MSM. Those were recorded in a film studio. But $540 million for that single contract. And this was just for the propaganda.
Nearly 200,000 direct war deaths, 4,500 U.S. troops killed, millions of refugees, as Alexei just showed us, and trillions of dollars spent. This is the cost of the invasion. Where does the... You're talking about this argument of weapons of mass destruction. Correct. And the intelligence given that there was something and then never ending up turning up.
Yeah, the case was made by Cheney and the president and Powell and Rumsfeld that Saddam Hussein had all manner of weapons of mass destruction, and he was likely to give them to terrorists. Okay, this is after 9/11, right? Fear, fear, fear. Now, he didn't have all manner of weapons of mass destruction. We, former intelligence...
The whole point of going into Iraq had nothing to do with saving the Iraqi people, though that was the pretext. Same thing in Libya.
So, I mean, that is the land of unconfirmed.
Yes, we came, we saw, he died.
Did it have anything to do with your visit?
No, I'm sure it did.
Libya had been the wealthiest nation on the African continent. They were using their oil resources to pay for housing for everyone. There was zero homelessness. Everyone had full health care. They had free education for life. Every married couple got a stipend and a piece of land on which to farm and support their family. It was really a model economy in many ways. But the point at which it was Gaddafi who wanted to introduce a gold-backed dinar and use that on the entire African continent, roll it out to other nations as well, that posed a direct threat to the US dollar, which the US has gone to war over and over again to defend. So that was Gaddafi's fatal error.
A man addressing an unseen crowd. Big strong boys for farm work, he says. 400. 700. 700. 800. The numbers roll in. These men are sold for 1,200 Libyan pounds, $400 apiece. You are watching an auction of human beings. Contacts are telling us that there are 1 to 2 of these auctions every month, and that there is one happening in the next few hours.
Then comes Syria. Well, turns out Syria has a gold-backed currency that it is trying to roll out in terms of using it in trade and other aspects of managing its economy. Highly secular nation, as was Libya. No homelessness, free health care, free education, same kinds of things we saw in Iraq and Libya. So the U.S. in 2010 undertook a campaign where they were finished in Libya, so they trucked in all of these terrorists from Libya through Turkey into Syria inside World Food Organization trucks. Serena Shim, an American journalist, actually caught them doing this on film in January of 2013, and she was promptly assassinated the next day. Syria has a ton of oil in the Golan Heights, which is being illegally occupied by Israel, and they're removing that oil and selling it to a company by the name of Genie Energy. That's just one of the many moneyed interests in the region that are affecting our military presence in that country. So these are the people who run Genie Energy. Jacob Rothschild, who controls the left-leaning media, so that would be the New York Times, CNN, The Economist, but Rothschild controls the left side. Another key player at Genie Energy is Rupert Murdoch. Well, Rupert Murdoch controls the right side of the media spectrum, and that includes Fox News and Dick Cheney, who, was an aggressive warmonger. Bill Richardson. So this is bipartisan. Bill Richardson is a heavyweight Democrat who also is the board of Genie Energy. James Woolsey, who is a former CIA director. And we know for a fact that it is the CIA who runs all these operations in these countries in order to overthrow them. Larry Summers is another member of the board of directors on Genie Energy. One example of the many different types of business interests that are driving our foreign policy. And it's to serve those business interests, not the interests of the American people. We're starting to see play out, for example, in Iran, where the CIA opened a covert office there in July or June of last year, where they specifically said that they intended to overthrow the government through this office. Meanwhile, we administered these crushing sanctions, which Mike Pompeo openly claimed he would starve Iranians to death should the administration not bend to U.S. will. These are war crimes. These are the exact same things that happened with Iraq, Libya, and Syria, to devastate the population to such an extent that they revolt against their own leadership. But that has failed nearly every time. And it's because we're invading these countries that actually really do provide for their people and are secular until we come there bringing the terrorists and installing these puppet regimes that are extremist, totalitarian, and are puppets of the plutocrat. The plutocrats are not just trying to steal these resources and make money off the war themselves, because there's the weapons manufacturers who are selling all these jets and tanks and munitions that are making tons of money. And then there's all the oil and gold that's being stolen. Libya, we know all of Gaddafi's gold was stolen. It can't be located. There are these trade routes that run through these countries, which the U.S. wants to control for purposes of trafficking illicit cargo. Regular trade deals work for normal sale of goods and trade of goods. But the real big money is the shuttling of weapons, drugs, humans, and organs across from the east to the west to Western Europe on the Silk Road trade route, and then up and down to the African continent. So if you look at a map, it's really easy to see where the conflict is and why. So for example, where the U.S. is in Iraq and Syria is in the northern parts of those countries, which are at where the Silk Road trade route cuts through going west. And so the US wants to control what goes through that region. So the US CIA staged a chemical attack, which they blamed on Assad and then used as a pretext to invade. In November of 2016, the New York Times reported on an investigation it had conducted, which showed ISIS had used chemical weapons in Syria and Iraq during the years 2014, 15, and 16 at least 52 times. Yet every time this accusation of chemical weapons usage comes up, it's always directed at Assad, and there is not one shred of evidence to support that accusation. So in 1979, former National Security Director Zbigniew Brzezinski openly admitted in an interview that it was in fact the CIA that armed and funded the Mujahideen in Afghanistan in 1979, specifically to lure Russia into war there. The official story, he admitted, was that the US arrived 6 months later, but that was a lie. And so as all of this is happening, they've created millions of refugees that are desperately either trying to get back home or find somewhere to go. They're fleeing the violence. One of the big aspects of these migrations is not only to disrupt the nations in which these people were living to make it easier to steal the resources, but it's also to push them into other countries that the US wants to weaken over Europe, because it destabilizes communities there. It consumes massive amounts of resources that leave the native populations depleted and unable to care for themselves. And it foments racial hatred and anger, which further destabilizes these locations. And this is how sort of this colonialist approach works, is by weakening the existing population and allowing the invaders to gain a foothold.
Germany is facing a drastic number of refugees by the end of 2015, believed to be in the region of 1.5 million.
It is not quite on a biblical scale, but an exodus it certainly is. Migrants who've been trapped at the railway station in Budapest now deciding to walk the hundreds of miles to Germany and what they see as the promised land.
The other side of this tragedy is how it will change Europe. Non-Western migrants had already been flooding into Europe for decades. Leaders refuse to stop it.
We are afraid. We are in danger every day, every minute. They're coming inside, the police. They want to kill each other. You have to do something. Someone has to protect us. They are in our house. We are the victims. We are not them. We have to live like before. We have to live our life. They took it for us. We're not in war. They are. They have to take them from here. It's a city. It's not a place for people like them.
French writer Renaud Camus calls the influx the Great Replacement and says it's the biggest thing to happen to France since the 15th century.
Quel est l'objectif? Ça va faire parler. Mais l'objectif, c'est relever le défi du métissage. Ce n'est pas un choix. C'est une obligation. Si ce volontarisme républicain ne fonctionnait pas, il faudra alors que la République passe à des méthodes plus contraignantes encore. Nous devons changer.
The United Nations report says Sweden will be a third world nation in about 15 years, below Libya and Bulgaria.
And is what we're seeing now in Europe with the efforts to weaken Germany, France, Norway, Sweden, like all those countries that are very stable and otherwise equitable are being ripped apart by these waves of immigrants, are on the receiving end of a lot of hatred and resentment. Formation of the EU is really what made this possible. And if you look at how the EU works, you can see tremendous similarities to what happened in the United States with the formation of the Republic. It allowed centralized control over, numerous otherwise sovereign states. So that was the goal of the formation of the EU, is that the UN and NATO and these other more global institutions could impose their will on these previously sovereign states. One of the ways that they did that was require each of these countries, the member EU nations, to accept a certain number of refugees. And this is one of the things we're seeing now, for example, is that Italy, Hungary, and several other nations are like, no, we can't do it. We are not prepared to handle such an influx. And no, but it's really causing a lot of upheaval across the EU, but it's a way of controlling the allocation of resources around Europe in ways that punish states that refuse to comply with the policy decisions of these billionaires. And so one of the things that's helpful to know, I think, too, for Hungary, for example, is a member of a group called Schengen. I believe it's about 26 nations. And they have an agreement among them whereby those nations on the perimeter will vet any refugees or immigrants coming into the area of the Schengen, so that the other member nations don't have to conduct their own process for vetting the immigrants. And when you have this massive wave of people coming, you can't properly vet them without slowing the process down. And that's when Hungary really got targeted for a smear campaign. It was 3 or 4 years ago when they put up a fence. So they erected a fence to try and manage so that people weren't just flooding in. They live up to their obligations because they couldn't by just letting people in, and they were creating a security risk for all these other nations. But that's just one example of how, a practical reality, these waves of refugees, is that, again, the propaganda is such that it directly fuels racial animosity, violence, and is at the same time further undermining these communities, because the people who are actually coming in as refugees are not legitimate refugees. The vast majority of them are young men who are being smuggled in order to set up these terror cells. An example I can give in the US, for example, General Michael Flynn investigated Fethullah Gulen, who was brought to the United States in 1998, I believe, by Bill Clinton under protection of the CIA. Well, Fethullah Gulen has built a network of charter schools around the country. And the State Department issued an email in 2012, I believe it was, stating their concern that regarding the number of visa applicants from Turkey looking for work at these Gulen charter schools, having no English skills and no teaching credentials. So this was a problem that the State Department flagged. Meanwhile, General Michael Flynn investigated what was going on with Gulen and found that he had built a $25 billion terror network around the U.S. that was later confirmed by a former FBI agent who went and visited some of these madrasas himself. What this FBI agent found was that these refugees were being brought to the U.S. The supposed refugees, they're not. They were young men who were being brought here to train as terrorists, and then they were shipped back to Pakistan, from where they were then distributed around the Mideast wherever they were needed. It actually makes me hopeful that, in fact, that whole process will be completely disrupted by these individual nations recapturing their sovereignty and saying, no, to these practices, which will minimize them, but it's just wreaked havoc all over Europe, and it's by design. This is the intended result, and it just makes it much easier to install puppet leaders, to loot resources, to establish military bases, and otherwise subvert the previous governments that had existed there.
Do you hear the people singing the songs of angry men? It is the music of a people who will not be slaves again. When the beating of your heart echoes the beating of the drums, there is a life about to start when tomorrow comes. Give all you can give so that our land may advance. Some will fall and some will live. Will you stand up and take a chance? The blood of the martyrs will water the meadows of France. Do you hear the people singing the songs of angry men? This is the music of a people who will not be slaves again. When the beating of your heart echoes the beating of the drums, there is a life about to start when tomorrow comes.
Thank you for joining us again. See you next time. Good night.